accomplished market analyst and industry expert with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our very distinguished guest, Mr. Craig Moffett.
So thank you. First, it's not just an honor to be here, but also a pleasure to see so many people that I've gotten to know over the years. The odd part about being an analyst is that you get to know a lot of people, and over time, you like them more than they like you. Being an analyst is not a great way to be popular. So I thought I would share with you, just briefly to set expectations. I am the telecom side of MoffettNathanson in our founding. My partner, Michael Nathanson, was the media side. So I'm going to primarily keep my remarks focused on telecom, but I'm happy to take questions about media, and we'll try to do my best to put my Michael Nathanson hat on and answer as I think Michael would. And we'll try to save a lot of time for Q&A. But I thought I would talk about a handful of things. I want to start and mostly talk about the broadband market in the United States. I'll share some thoughts about the broadband market and unit growth. I'm going to talk about usage trends that we're seeing in the volumes of data being used in broadband. And then I'll talk about the fiber industry and some thoughts on fiber building and overbuilding. That's interesting segue into some brief remarks about BEAD. And then I'll talk about the wireless market and share some thoughts on wireless as well. And then finally close with a few thoughts on convergence, the wireless and wired broadband convergence. So first, with respect to the broadband market, I think now in retrospect, our understanding of what happened in 2020 was probably wrong. The narrative coming out of the early days of COVID was that COVID exposed an enormous pent-up demand for broadband, and the need for work at home and distance learning created this pull forward of growth, and that narrative was very comfortable and appealing enough that it was probably a little too easy for all of us to accept. I think in retrospect, what happened was probably less about, let's face it, almost everybody knew by 2020 that broadband was a good thing to have. What really changed in 2020 was the affordability of broadband for lower income customers. That was first a function of state level regulations that prohibited disconnecting households if they were unable to pay their bills. It was followed by the EBB program, the Emergency Broadband Benefit, at the federal government. There were a variety of subsidy programs that came out of the CARES Act, and then obviously that culminated in lower dollar amounts per household, but larger enrollment in ACP. And that series of events starting in 2020 created a real distortion in the market. The broadband growth rate in 2020 and into the early part of 2021 was dramatically inflated. The growth rate, I would argue, in 22 and 23 was more or less normal in terms of growth, but from an inflated plateau. But in terms of percentage growth rates, it wasn't unusual. And then when all the subsidies were withdrawn at the beginning of 2024, first with the elimination of new enrollments in February of 24, and then terminations of the program in June of 24, remember that the way the companies report their numbers, if you were unable to pay your bill after June, you went into 30 days delinquency, then you went into 60 days delinquency, then you went into collection before you were finally considered a default. And so those didn't show up until the fourth quarter, even if they effectively stopped paying in June. So you really had this gradual erosion of the supernormal growth that was created in 2020, suppressing growth in 2024. In some ways, while that is, I think, a rather sad story for a lot of American households who had broadband for a while and now don't, in terms of the health of the broadband market, it's probably slightly comforting that I think the broadband market growth rate will re-accelerate this year to something more like a normal level. 2024 was a clearly suppressed level. It's, by our estimation, the first year that broadband penetration in the United States actually fell, at least fell in markets that were not newly built. Confounding all of this, obviously, is that there's a lot of rural building going on, and I'll get to that when I talk about BEAD in a minute. And that makes all the numbers a little fuzzier and harder to make out exactly what's going on. In terms of market share, it's been interesting, that narrative that I just gave you about broadband market growth happened to coincide right around 2020 and especially 2021 with the introduction of fixed wireless access from initially Verizon and T-Mobile, and then more recently from AT&T. I'm going to leave aside the WISP market, which is sort of a little outside of this conversation. But the growth of fixed wireless access put enormous pressure on cable operators, partly because, and in particularly in 2024, when that still steady growth from FWA was felt in the context of an industry that was suddenly adding 2 million or about 1.5 million fewer subscribers than it had the prior year because of the withdrawal of ACP. Interestingly, if you think about the world through the lens of year-over-year change in net additions, so not just the absolute number of net additions, fixed wireless is still taking by far the largest number of customers, but through the lens of year-over-year change in net additions, fixed wireless is actually growing a little more slowly than it was a year ago. Fiber is growing a little more slowly than it was a year ago. DSL is shrinking at about the same pace as it was a year ago. Satellite is actually surprisingly not growing all that much faster than it was a year ago. There's been a big shift from geostationary satellite broadband to LEO satellite. But by and large, the growth at Starlink has come at the expense of geo-satellite alternatives. So if I just rewind all of that and say, okay, so the simple math of the broadband market is I've got household formation. I add to that, if I'm thinking about any of the downstream players, I add to that the number of DSL customers who are leaving DSL for higher speeds. That's roughly unchanged. By the way, household formation, roughly unchanged. DSL, roughly unchanged. Fiber, year-over-year change in net additions, roughly unchanged. Fixed wireless access, slightly slower than it was a year ago. In fact, to be more accurate, fiber was actually slightly slower than a year ago also. And yet, cable fell really dramatically. That speaks to not the narrative that competitive intensity got worse. It speaks to the narrative that the market growth rate was suppressed by ACP, and that we will start to see things normalize in 2025. I mean, that's my expectation. The growth rate of the market will continue to be slower, particularly as the rural expansion programs have largely run their course. I think one of the real insights from BEAD is that by the time we got to being ready to put shovels in the ground, there's not that much left of the country to build. And what's left is so rural that it's not terribly attractive. Second thing I want to talk about is usage trends. It's been quite interesting having observed this now for about 30 years. that we've seen, you can create two narratives. One is that usage per subscriber is exploding in the US. I'm talking about fixed rather than mobile now. That usage per subscriber is exploding in the United States, and today, 23.4% of US households, according to data from OpenVault, which is a service provider, or a platform broadband platform provider, software and broadband tools for smaller cable operators. According to OpenVault, about 23.4% of American households today consume more than a terabyte of data. Just a couple of years ago, that was low single digits. And 6% now use 2 terabytes of data per month. And that has more than tripled in just the last 3 years, I think. So by one narrative, the growth of usage is absolutely exploding. On the other hand, a more accurate way of looking at it is simply that today the average household usage is about 698 gigabytes per month. That's the mean average. The median is a little bit lower than that, but the mean average is, call it 700 gigabytes per month. And that is now growing at 8.9% a year, which is the slowest growth rate that we have seen for broadband usage ever. For almost a decade and a half, it was about 25% compound annual growth rate. Some of that may have been pull forward of incremental usage during, you had about 35% growth during the beginning of COVID, and so some of that, if you level it over a few years, is a little more normal. But there is no question that the usage growth rate does seem to be decelerating. And it makes sense, right? If you go back and say, starting from web pages that were all text to web pages that each image on a web page was roughly 10 times the load of a text web page, even after compression. And so for a typical, take an Amazon that went, you go from a text list to product images, and every other website in the world doing the same thing. It is at least an order of magnitude growth. Going from still pictures to standard definition video, even with compression, is about another order of magnitude growth. Going from standard video to high def video is another order of magnitude growth. And so you've had roughly 3 orders of magnitude, so you've had something like a 10,000-fold increase in the volume per web page or per viewing event. But what's happening now is not geometric like that was. Now what we're seeing is linear. It is, there used to be one person in the household streaming Netflix, and then there were 2 people in the household streaming Netflix, and maybe there were 3 people in the household streaming Netflix, and maybe there were even 4 people, but it ain't gonna be 16 people, right? You eventually get to the natural limits of a lot of this stuff. Now you can still stack all of these things on top of each other. There is still rising penetration of streaming video. There is still rising number of hours that people spend watching streaming video, and there is still rising number of people per household streaming video simultaneously, and stack all of those, and that's not to say that broadband growth is going to be slow. It's still going to be really robust, but it's not going to be a 25% compound annual growth rate anymore. And that has real implications for the viability of FWA and how long the runway is for fixed wireless access, because fixed wireless access, by virtue of sharing infrastructure with the mobile network, is inarguably capacity constrained. In fact, I'll come back to that in just a second. And the same, you could say the same thing about Starlink, where we first modeled Starlink's capacity back in 2021, I think, was our first Starlink piece, maybe a little later than that. But we estimated that that about now they would have room to serve about 1 million people in the United States. Today, at the end of last year, they had about 1.3 million, so they're about 30 to 40% ahead of what we expected. By and large, that's not because they're ahead in launching satellites. They've launched satellites at about the same pace we expected. They've launched, they've increased the capacity of their satellites at about the same pace we expected. But the usage growth per household has grown more slowly, and therefore you can support more people on the platform for capacity reasons. Now, it doesn't mean you can support 5 times as many, but incrementally it makes a difference. I want just to go back to the FWA capacity point for a second. We did some work, this goes back a ways, but we did some work a while back that said, if you, this is back when T-Mobile was saying they would get to between 8 and 9 million fixed wireless access customers in America. Today they've raised that by about a year ago. But we said, just some back of the envelope math of what an average household uses in terms of volume. Growing that, now admittedly we grew that at a 25% compound annual growth rate at the time. Today I think you would assume a lower growth rate, but grow that at a 25% annual growth rate. And by the end of the decade, the customers, those 8 million customers that T-Mobile would have, would be using something like 25 times as much network capacity as the entire mobile base does today. And they would be generating an incremental 5% of revenue. Now, as a network loading proposition as an engineer, it's not ideal to say I'm going to increase the load of my network 25-fold for a 5% increase in revenues. So ultimately you do have capacity constraints. Now, if you also grow simultaneously the usage of your mobile customer base, which has been growing at about a 35% compound annual growth rate per customer, that group also ends up using about 25 times more capacity than you have today. And so over the course of a decade, you end up with about a 50-fold increase in the load on the network. Now that may sound mind-boggling. That's not that different than what you had over the last decade. Except over the last decade, you had a huge increment of spectrum added to the market, and you had some enormous technology advances in the market that are much less likely to be repeated. And so I would submit that even with a slower growth rate for broadband usage, which extends the runway for fixed wireless, there is simply no argument that fixed wireless is ultimately going to be a capacity constrained part of the market, and therefore it does not have an infinitely long runway. Next topic I want to talk about. Let's talk about fiber for a second. By most estimates, fiber today, and I'm going to, by the way, call it fiber overbuilding, which is to say fiber being built in places where there is already a cable infrastructure. I know a lot of people only call it overbuilding when it is a second fiber infrastructure in a given geography. So just to be clear what the terminology difference is. Most people today would say that fiber covers about half of the country, maybe a little bit less than half of the country. Cable covers something like 90% of the country. Some of that is FTTH or fiber to the home. Some of it is HFC. Most of it is HFC. But having done this years ago, and I will show my advanced age, unfortunately, I was part of the very first design projects for what later became Verizon Fios, back when it was still part of NYNEX, back in the mid-1990s. And we were planning, we didn't even have the term broadband networks yet, but we were planning fiber networks. And the overwhelmingly most important issue in the economics of deploying fiber is density, right? It should be obvious, but if for any given cost per mile, if you have half the number of homes along that route, the cost per home pass is going to double. And we started looking at that through the lens of homes per square mile, where I used to have a chart that I would refer to all the time that said, let's just take a look at the deciles of the US population by density of homes per square mile. And I'll get these numbers slightly wrong, but the densest decile, the top 10% of the United States, living in the densest census blocks in the US have something like 12,000 or 13,000 homes per square mile. Obviously, those are New York City, Manhattan, and in Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx, but also parts of Chicago and LA and so on. The second densest decile is about 2/3 that. The third densest decile is about half that. The fourth decile is about half that. And if you go through the middle of that curve, each decile is about half as dense as the prior decile, which means at a given cost per home passed, each decile you move into, you better be doubling your cost per home passed. And if your penetration assumption stays the same, and your average revenue per customer assumption stays the same, and your margin assumption stays the same, then your economic return got cut in half each time you move from one decile to the next. And so we always would point out, look, I hear people say 70% of the United States is going to be overbuilt with fiber. That's nuts. The seventh decile in the United States has less than 400 homes per square mile. The third decile is something like 5,000. But people are still taking their cost per home pass from the third decile and applying it to the seventh decile and saying, well, if I build at that cost, here's the return I can get. You can't build at that cost in the seventh decile. You just can't. We later updated that with the help of OpenSignal to say, okay, fair pushback is that homes are not evenly distributed throughout a census block. They tend to be distributed along roads. And so the right metric is not homes per square mile, the right metric is really homes per road mile. In an analysis we did with them, we said, let's sort the world into buckets. Let's do a first analysis, which is, what's the number of homes per road mile for each of the major fiber overbuilders in the United States as of the end of 2022. And most of them were density of somewhere around 100 homes per road mile, say. And then we said, what are they building over the last 2 years, in 23 and 24? And in every case, it was dramatically lower, which of course makes sense because any sensible operator would build their densest markets first, and then what's left is less dense, right? Because you build the most attractive stuff first. Every operator was therefore in the range of 80 or below. Frontier, for example, was building at 60 homes per road mile. AT&T was building at about 80 homes per road mile. So then we did another analysis, which says 80 is usually the cutoff that people will use to say a market is dense enough to be worth building as a second player in if it's got 80 homes per road mile. At 60 homes per road mile, it's probably not, but since that's what Frontier was doing, we used that as a cutoff also. And then we also looked at 35 homes per road mile, which is usually the rule of thumb you would use for, I'm not even going to do it as the only game in town unless I get a government subsidy, because it's just not dense enough to earn a return. So the first question we asked after that was, for someone like AT&T, what percentage of their remaining footprint that they haven't gotten to with fiber is still 80 homes per road mile or better? And the answer is, it turns out that about half of what's left is still about 80 homes or better, which is sort of encouraging to say they still have a fair amount of territory that's worth building. But then we asked one more really interesting question, which was, and of that 50%, how much of it has someone else already beaten you to the punch? Has one of the independents, whether it's a MetroNet or a Lumos or any of the, or Brightspeed or any of the others that are building the sort of the free radicals, as John Malone would have called them, who are building themselves? And the answer is 24% of the opportunity for AT&T had already been taken by someone else. So that only 38% of their footprint that they haven't built yet is dense enough to build, and would they not be the third player into the market? And it was remarkable how quickly that gap was being closed by all these private equity funded independents. My guess is, now step back a little bit and just think about the environment that we're in. Cost per mile is rising dramatically. We just used some data from the FBA. I don't know if we have anybody from the FBA here in the audience, but we used some data from the FBA to illustrate just how quickly the cost per the Fiber Broadband Association, to illustrate how quickly the cost per mile was rising in the United States, partly because of materials costs. Tariffs won't help that, although a lot of the materials, thankfully, are made here in the US. Corning fiber, for example, is largely produced in North Carolina, for example. But there are still, obviously, parts of the equipment and bucket trucks and things like that that are largely made outside of the US. So the equipment cost for deploying fiber is going to rise considerably. But the labor cost is likely to rise dramatically. The reduction in net immigration as a function of the change in immigration policies in the US is going to be enormously inflationary for the construction trades. And fiber installers, and less so the people who are connecting homes and more the people who are laying fiber along roads and railroad tracks and the like, are trained, but they operate in a universe of the labor market that includes the home builders, that includes the electrical utilities and that sort of thing. And a significant portion of that labor market is immigrant. And if you dramatically curtail the immigrant workforce, it will become much harder to fill those jobs, and it will be much more expensive to fill those jobs. And even the operators for whom those installers are on the permanent payroll will be in a labor market where they are competing to keep those people by rising bids from the Dicoms of the world and from the electric utilities and home builders. So it doesn't take a genius to figure out that if you have dramatically rising cost per mile at the same time as you have dramatically falling homes per road mile, that the cost of fiber deployment is going parabolically higher. That, by the way, is why I've always argued it is completely unrealistic to think that you're going to have price wars in broadband when new entrants enter the market. The new entrants who are entering the market are trying to cost justify the fact that they built at much higher cost in each incremental city that they get to. And if you can't change your penetration assumption and you can't change and your costs are what they were and you can't change your margin assumption, you only have one lever left to pull, and that's charge more. Simple as that. And so there is still significant upward pressure on pricing in broadband. BEAD, by the way, we started having doubts about BEAD as we started to see the first data coming in from people like Cartesian and that sort of thing when the maps were being published that suggested that the available market for rural construction has gotten so much smaller because of unsubsidized building happening quickly at places like Charter, that has so much of the opportunity has already been captured that what's left is so rural it's just not attractive. Now somebody will build it. The subsidies will have to be quite high. I certainly agree with the people who say that it is sensible to assume that alternative technologies, and particularly LEO satellite, make an awful lot of sense for the very, very rural parts of the country, because it just doesn't make sense to start building $50,000 and $60,000 line extensions for communities of 6 people, right? But the BEAD program, I think, I think we would all in this room concede that the dollar amounts of the BEAD program were not chosen at all out of any analysis of how big is the problem and what's it going to cost. The dollar amounts were chosen based on what number did I hear last, and let me see if I can make it even bigger. And so maps didn't even exist to measure how many homes were needed to be built when they chose $42.5 billion. Quickly talk about wireless, and then I'll just wrap with some thoughts on convergence. The conundrum we've struggled with about the wireless market for the last few years now is that the market growth rate in number of subscribers has consistently been, since about the year 2012. It dipped all the way to 0 in 2013 when I won't bore you with the accounting details, but when they changed the accounting of, they moved to something called EIP, or everyday equipment, everyday installment plans, or equipment installment plans, that were essentially saying customers would buy their own phones and we would end subsidies. And the market growth rate crashed to essentially 0 for 1 year. And by the end of that year, we were already back to subsidizing phones again, and the market growth reaccelerated. But market growth right now is about 2.3%, and population growth is 0.5%. By the way, population growth in the United States, and this is an important point, population growth in the United States based on birth rate alone is less than 0. We have the exact same problem that China and Japan have of negative population growth. The one thing that made our population continue to grow was immigration. And so if we tighten immigration, we're talking about a demographic problem that of negative population growth. And as we've seen with Japan, it is very hard for a country to deal with negative population growth. Creates all kinds of dislocations. But the wireless market is growing. Now, to be more rigorous, you would say, I don't really care about what population growth is now. I really care about what population growth was, say, 12 years ago, if you think the average first-time age of a phone is 12 years old, or I care about what population growth was 11 years ago, if you think the average person's getting their first phone at 11. You can grow the number of phones, and by the way, when I say number of phones, I'm including prepaid and postpaid together. It does not make sense to think about postpaid only. But you can think about contributions to growth in excess of population from falling age of first-time phone owners. But for it to be double the population growth, you would have to assume the average age of a first-time buyer is getting 1 year younger every year, and it's been doing that for 12 years. So that would say we'd be giving people phones in their cradles. We're not doing that yet. So that may be contributing, but a relatively small contributor. Tragically, by the way, there was a spike in growth rate in the industry right after the Uvalde shooting, because the average age of first-time phone owners dropped significantly because parents said it's not safe to have a child at school without having a phone. Heartbreaking thing to think about. We keep arguing, and we've been wrong in saying so, but I'll still stick to it, that ultimately the growth rate in phone subscriptions in the United States has to fall back to population growth. It is a fully saturated market, and you can only manipulate the numbers so much by creating extra lines that people don't need. You know, there was a long argument that you would get if you walked into a phone store, that they would say, well, we've got to buy one and get one free on iPhones right now, and even though, so as long as you're trading yours in, why don't you also get an extra one for your wife, your son, whoever's on your family plan? And just take whatever the oldest device is in the plan, stick the new number that you have to take in order to qualify, stick it on that old clamshell phone that you've got, leave it in your drawer, and don't forget to cancel the number in 2 years. And that was happening in all three of the big three. And so that tended to inflate growth. But ultimately, there is a gravitational pull toward population growth in an industry that is fully saturated. So the reason I bring that up is because immigration matters dramatically there too. Last year, there were 6.8 million new households, or new phone subscriptions in the United States. By our estimate, there were about 1.5 million new immigrants in the United States. So if you take immigration out of the equation, you're talking about the net adds for the wireless industry falling by about a third, or between a quarter and a third. We still haven't seen that hit, but I think it is very likely that you will see a real pressure on growth. The other thing you're seeing in wireless is significant price inflation as the carriers push through higher prices. But I would take that with a little bit of a grain of salt, because at the same time they're doing that, they're also raising the promotional values by about the same amount. So the lifetime value of a customer has actually gone down a little bit rather than up, because the promotional inflation has been faster than the ARPU inflation, or the average revenue per user inflation. So I would caution when people look at the average, look at these price increases that they keep seeing, to not overestimate the rate at which the wireless industry is raising prices. They're simply offsetting higher and higher subsidies by trying to take a little bit of price in return. Last thought is on convergence. And I think there is a broad narrative that the telcos are winning in convergence. First, it's important to say there is nothing that, from a product perspective or a service perspective, that you can do that is unique by offering wireless and broadband together. And I've worked with carriers around the world who are trying to figure out advantaged ways to do that all the way back in the mid-1990s. Deutsche Telecom and others who've spent 20, 25, 30 years trying to figure out, is there a way to be advantaged? There really isn't. But that doesn't mean you can't have cost advantage. And so if you can actually have a cost advantage by selling two things on the same platform and sell it for less, makes all the sense in the world. You have to offer it at a discount. And customers like discounts, so that's why bundles do well. But you have to have an underlying cost advantage, or else you're just giving a discount. And the cost advantage in offering a bundle, really, that advantage goes to the cable operators much more so than the telcos. The telcos don't really get to build fiber any cheaper by virtue of having a wireless network in the neighborhood. The cable operators, on the other hand, do get to offer wireless more cheaply by being able to offload traffic onto their existing wired infrastructure. So ultimately, the cost advantage resides with the cable operators, as does the footprint advantage. You know, AT&T has fiber in about 14% of the country today. If they build out everything they've promised, it'll eventually get to 20% of the country. It is simply not a credible strategy to say, I'm going to try to market my wireless service when it's only available to 1 in 5 households. And so T-Mobile has has fiber in 1.5% of the country. They're hoping it eventually gets to 7. Again, not a credible strategy. Verizon, even buying Frontier, takes their number from 11 to about 14. Again, not a credible strategy. The only ones who can offer a converged offering everywhere are the cable operators. So I would argue cable is actually significantly advantaged. And I will happily take your own comments about whether you think a cable merger could happen with the telcos. I tend to think not. I think that as long as FWA is available everywhere, the example everybody points to is, why won't Charter be acquired by T-Mobile? And to me, the answer is because T-Mobile competes with Charter everywhere in Charter's footprint with fixed wireless broadband, and Charter competes with T-Mobile everywhere in T-Mobile's footprint with wireless. And I don't care what administration you're in, that is still almost certainly an antitrust violation and probably wouldn't get through the first phase of a regulatory review. So I'm going to end it there. I think I went a little bit long, but hopefully we still have a little time for questions. Is that
Time for questions?
so? A couple of questions. So
Anyone?
I'll do that.
yeah.
We love you at Charter. We actually bring your analyst reports everywhere. So far be it for me to question any of your assumptions or conclusions. But on the usage point that you made, how much do you think of new technologies from a consumer perspective, unforeseen? How much do you guys factor that in?
Well, unforeseen is the key question there, right? Because you could see video coming 20 years before it came. You could see HD video coming 20 years before it came, and the standards for HD were passed in 1985, and HD didn't, and HD didn't really start to explode until 2005. It takes a long time, and you can usually see this stuff coming. There is nothing in the pipeline today. AI does not generate a significant amount of traffic. It generates a significant amount of compute, but it doesn't generate a significant amount of traffic. You send an AI query, it's small, there's a huge amount of processing that goes on, and then they send back an AI answer, which is relatively small. Even generating your own still images is relatively small if I'm generating graphics. If it becomes a thing to say it's just fun to create long videos using AI, and it just becomes a hobby for people, and then therefore there is a massive amount of video production being done by working with any of a whole set of AI video, then that could consume more video traffic, although even that would probably just substitute for Netflix type of traffic and probably wouldn't generate all that much incremental traffic. So you really have to go to AR, VR, and something like the Vision Pro goggles, and there's just no real evidence that that's going to catch on. So I think you're talking a long way out before you see something that changes the trajectory.
Okay, Craig, thank you so much. We're very thankful.